I think when men are finding a liturgy that is dominated by an emphasis on their emotions and on feeling good and on all of these gentle qualities, on gentle Jesus, meek and mild, on the lamb rather than the lion of Judah, it drives them away.
G'day everyone, welcome to the Thomas More Centre channel. My name is Mark Makowiecki and today it's my pleasure to be interviewing Professor Barry Spurr. Barry, welcome to the channel.
Good morning, Mark. Pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you on. So Barry, you are the literary editor at Quadrant magazine and formerly a professor of poetics and poetry, or poetry and poetics at the University of Sydney. Can you tell us when you became interested in poetry and how it captured your imagination?
Well, I think originally, Mark, it happened in the home, as these things often do. My parents were very interested in words and language. My father was a journalist, one of the old-fashioned kind that was very meticulous about words and the meaning of words. There was a constant series of corrections when I got things wrong, even as a small child. And my mother was very musical. She was a stenographer by profession, but that's also dealing with words, of course. So it was just a very... not oppressively so, but a home that was interested in words and language. And my father would read to me most nights in bed. And I think that was where there was this original interest. And then, of course, at school, I found that I was drawn more to the humanities than the sciences. And, of course, English was central to that. And in those days, it's a long time ago now, in the Australian school system and elsewhere, there was a good deal of emphasis on poetry. Poetry had a major part of the English curriculum. It's receded for a number of reasons over the many decades since. And so I was exposed to a fair bit of it then. But I've always thought, Mark, with an interest in poetry, and many people have it, of course, is that it's rather like an interest in music. And I think the two things can be seen as an analogy of one another. T.S. Eliot has a famous essay on the music of poetry. And as you know, with music, so with poetry, a lot of it has to do with whether you have an ear for it or not. I mean, you can force someone to play an instrument, as people used to be past them today. If they haven't got the ear for music, they're never going to get there, and they're not going to enjoy it. Well, poetry is rather like that. It's different from the novel, and different from, obviously, from non-fictional prose, and even different from dramatic language, I think, because there you're focusing on the story, on the plot, on characterization, on the historical context with someone like Dickens and what have you. But poetry is more about showing rather than telling, and intuiting things emotionally and intellectually and spiritually. And that's I think at the end of the day, it sounds like a slight counsel of despair, but I think that's something that's got to be fairly well innate, really, rather like a musical ear, if you like. I think I was blessed to have that, and I loved poetry right through high school, and when I came to university, then I got interested in the whole intellectual and cultural context of poetry and poets' lives. So that was the way it developed. And now I've been obsessed with poetry for my entire adult life, and I have this wonderful job now as literary editor of Quadrant. I've succeeded Les Murray in that role. Les retired in 2018, and I'm receiving dozens and dozens of poems a month from writers, mostly from Australia, but from all over the world. So I'm seeing new poems every day.
And you mentioned T.S. Eliot, and you're a leading authority on him. And so I was wondering what attracted you to him, and what do you appreciate most about his life and work?
Yes, I've often been asked that, Mark, and the first exposure I had to him was a rather unusual one. It was a boys' school I was at in Canberra, and we put on Murder in the Cathedral, his first play from the 1930s about the martyrdom of Thomas à Becket. And in that play, there is a chorus of the women of Canterbury. Well, at an all-boys school, the boys had to be the women of Canterbury, and I was one of the women of Canterbury. And the beautiful choruses in that play struck a chord with me, because they're poetic works, really. They're poetry in the course of the play. But it really was at university where as I was saying earlier, I started to take an interest in the broader biographical, contextual, social, historical background and context of poetry that I got interested in Eliot because my interest was very much in his Christianity. And I would say that he is one of the leading Christian poets of the 20th century. And so, and that was what I did my postgraduate work on. So it was a slow process, as it often is, of isolating an interest for a thesis. And my fourth year honours thesis was on Eliot and Yeats. They were good friends, but quite different personalities and quite different poets. And then I did my postgraduate work on Eliot's Anglo-Catholicism. So that was setting the poetry in the larger context of his Christian faith, which dominated the second half of his life.
So you have a long and distinguished career teaching Eliot, among other poets, obviously, and maybe you could tell us what's the difference between poetry and poetics as well.
Oh, well, yes. I was invited very kindly to come up with the title for my chair. There'd never been a professor of poetry in Australia before, which is a little strange when you think about it. It's a well-known title in England, for example. There have been several professors of poetry, some very distinguished poets have held that chair. James Macaulay, was the reader in poetry at the University of Tasmania, the well-known Catholic poet James Macaulay, but then he became the professor of English. So he didn't become a professor of poetry, he became the professor of English at Tasmania. So I thought I would take that title. And then I thought that, well, I'm not a poet myself. And what I study when I'm getting down to the nitty-gritty of it all is the way the language works in a poem, and that's poetics. So that's why I added that when I was invited to give the title to the chair, so it didn't confuse people, though who knows, it may confuse people, that they might think that I'm a poet, because usually a professor of poetry has been a poet.
Mm-hmm.
Poetics is the study of the technical aspects of the way poetry works, rhythm, line, metre, and so on.
Mm-hmm. So you're 4 decades at the University of Sydney. I was wondering, did you notice any changes between the quality of students from the beginning of your career to the end? Because a lot's said about the degradation of education and whatnot. So shows your thoughts.
Well, undergraduates as a race never change, of course. They're full of life and enthusiasm and excitement. And in that way, the students were the same when I started and when I finished. But the difference when it came to teaching them in the English discipline was that I found a number of deficiencies becoming more and more apparent as the decades passed. A basic one was the increasing lack of an understanding of grammar and of the simple grammatical structure of a sentence. So I would find myself in later days correcting the most simplistic mistakes, misuse of certain sentences without a verb, this sort of thing. And they'd be surprised when I corrected them. I remember on a number of occasions students saying, I'm surprised I've had all these corrections and apparently lost marks for these mistakes because that never happened at school. Well, I'm thinking, well, why didn't it happen at school when you've been at school for 12 years? So that definitely was something that started to appear quite obviously as the decades passed. And also then too, because of the lack of regular essay writing right through high school, which was just a de rigueur, the regular thing when I was in high school with all your humanities subjects. You do an essay a week. And what happens now, and has been happening more recently, and so I start to see this happening too, was that they suddenly have to start writing what we would regard as formal essays only in year 11 in preparation for year 12, whereas we started writing them back in what we used to call first year, which I think is now year 7. I lose my mathematical count for that. I think that's the first year of high school now. So writing essays and the discipline of the essay, sustaining an argument and what have you, was something that was deeply embedded in our education at its best in the high school years in those many decades ago. But what I also found, I could go on endlessly about this, but what I also found was in the area of general knowledge, this seemed to be diminishing. Historical knowledge seemed almost to have vanished. And what a colleague of mine has called, who was there in the same time as I was, this growing denial of history, not only an ignorance of history, but outright denial of history, that what mattered only was now, what was happening now. and seeing things through the prism of now. Well, you can't read literature from the past through the prism of today. And just in an area which I think is of particular interest to us was the noticeable decline in general knowledge of Christianity, of the Judeo-Christian tradition, of basic biblical ideas. I lectured for many years on Paradise Lost. And when I started lecturing on that poem by Milton, the famous epic poem by Milton, I found that I didn't need to explain simple concepts, and the poem is essentially based upon the doctrine of original sin and the story of Adam and Eve and the serpent and the fall and redemption and what have you. But towards the end of my career, I found that even with in an honours seminar, the most distinguished students, I'd have to spell out these basic ideas that once you would have taken for granted in the culture generally, but also with some kind of Christian background. So that made the teaching of let's call Christian literature, biblically based literature, or literature that's based on church teaching and what have you, and the liturgy, harder to get across, or more painstaking effort, because you have to spell out these basic things which once you could more or less, I'm not saying everybody in 1974 understood all the details of the Bible and the doctrine and what have you, but you could assume more then than you could towards the end of my time, and I'm assuming that's the case now. So that's just reflecting the society, isn't it? The growing secularization of the society over the last half century.
Yeah. I experienced something similar. I think last year I was teaching core curriculum and asked who of my class knew the story of Adam and Eve, and none of them. And I'm thinking, how does a civilization that was built upon these myths and stories and the whole narrative of why we're here, once that's gone, like the civilization itself surely can't stand. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, that's the problem. I mean, how can you appreciate a work like Paradise Lost if you don't understand those stories and also don't understand the significance of them? And then you have this inability to understand why that was such a powerful text through the centuries. It was said by Lord Macaulay in the early 19th century, the historian, that if Paradise Lost, all books of it were wiped from the face of the earth, you'd have no trouble recovering the full 12 books, the full 10,000 lines of it, because so many people, including himself, knew it by heart.
Yeah. Yeah, we're in desperate need, aren't we? So speaking of Christianity, you grew up as a high church Anglican. You converted to Catholicism in 1995, and you presently attend the traditional Latin Mass. So I'm wondering, why did you convert, and when and why did you start going to the TLM?
Well, as you rightly say, I regard this as another blessing, another piece of good fortune. I grew up in a high church parish in Canberra with a solemn liturgy and beautiful music. We had an excellent choir master, and therefore we sang beautiful settings for the Mass, the Eucharist. And as I mentioned earlier, I studied T.S. Eliot's Anglo-Catholicism, and I'm assuming listeners will know something of what Anglo-Catholicism is. It's that movement in the Church of England which began really in the Oxford movement with such famous figures as John Henry Newman in the middle of the 19th century to try and recover what they regarded as the Catholic aspects and emphasise the Catholic aspects of Anglicanism. And right through into the 20th century, and Eliot was received into the Church of England in 1927, it's now 100 years ago, nearly, was baptised and confirmed in 1927. The general view then was twofold. First of all, the Anglo-Catholic or High Church attitude in Anglicanism was the dominant one. It isn't anymore. It was then. And this is what people may have forgotten or may never have known. There was the real conviction then that reunion with Rome was a viable possibility. It was the hope, and there were good reasons for supposing it might occur. Well, we know now that it won't, and it didn't, and it won't. And this naturally, doing scholarly research in this sort of area, but also being a practicing Christian and a practicing Anglican makes you think about these things. And I became more and more concerned, and I faced up to the fact that the reunion with Rome was not going to happen. There was all the hope further on into the century with ARCIC, for example, that international commission of the Vatican and Canterbury. And then came the ordination of women in the middle of the 1970s. And that was a thunderclap for many Anglican Catholics, as we would call ourselves, or Anglo-Catholics, if you prefer the more old-fashioned phrase. And then I thought, well, I've got to do something about this. I can't go on in this delusion that there is going to be a reunion, that the Anglican Communion will be absorbed into the Western Church, the division, and it will be and so a little bit slowly, but these things can take time, discernment and what have you. And I met people in the 1990s who were setting up the traditional liturgy, the old rite, as you might call it, in the Archdiocese of Sydney. And curiously, just as fate might have it, it's just down the road from where I live in Lewisham. So, I mean, one's been all over the place and in various parishes all over the world and everything, but I found my home out home. And I became friends with the folk who were setting it up, and I started attending the liturgy, and I felt this is right. And so I was received, as you rightly said, in 1995, and I've been going there ever since.
Yeah. Funnily enough, I attended there, I think, from 2012 to 2013 or so while I was at Campion College, and got married in Thomas Becket down the road, which is now, I believe, where the Ordinariate is, maybe?
No, they were in Newtown for a while. St. Joseph's in Newtown. They're now in Killara, quite a distance away from them.
I think I did visit them at least once, but we'll get into the Ordinariate in due course. So, on the matter of the liturgy, you've recently published a book entitled Language in the Liturgy. What motivated you to write it?
Well, the first book I wrote about this matter, which is to do with the reform of the liturgy, but with a particular focus on language, was called The Word in the Desert. And that came out in that important year of my life in 1995. And the publisher contacted me a couple of years ago and said that it had finally sold out. It took quite a few years to sell out. It did finally sell out. And would I be interested in writing a new book? And I said I wouldn't be interested in just updating that book. I think that I needed to write something in the same spirit, but completely new. And the one chapter in that first book, The Word in the Desert, which I felt had lasted, the other chapters were about the controversies of the 1970s and 1980s. Well, in the 2020s, those controversies are long ago. So the one chapter that did wear well was called The Language of Liturgy. So that was what I said to him, that I would be interested in writing a new book which focused on what is liturgical language, what is liturgical language at its best, what is wrong with so much liturgical language in the Anglican and Catholic churches today since the reforms of half a century ago. And so that's what encouraged me to write this book.
Okay, and so on the because you're a fellow TLMer, I guess we're always interested in a bit of the controversy around it. And so I thought I'd raise with you the motu proprio that Pope Francis wrote. And in the letter accompanying it, which was restricting the traditional Latin Mass, he asserted that the Second Vatican Council willed the large-scale liturgical reform which emerged in its wake. So I was wondering what your view on this matter was.
Well, three important facts need to be recognised and are not always recognised about the Second Vatican Council. And Pope Benedict, who attended it, of course, as you know, as Father Ratzinger, so therefore I think we can rely on his testimony, said, first of all, that not only did the Council not propose changing from the Latin Rite to the vernacular tongues, further, he said, in regard to that had that been proposed, it would have been, I think I'm quoting him literally, resoundingly rejected. Two, because I also write about music, as I think I indicated, I had a bit of a church music background as well, so that's a chapter in my new book. The council documents say, I think it's in Sacrosanctum Concilium, the main liturgical document of the council. It might be in Musicum Sacrum, the other one on music, but whatever it is, it's stated clearly that the Gregorian chant should have, and I quote exactly, pride of place in liturgical celebrations in the post-conciliar period. And thirdly, it did not envisage the turning around from the ad orientem eastward-facing position in the sanctuary to the ad populum westward-facing one that is now universal in the Novus Ordo rite. So for the present Pope to say that the liturgical reforms, and I think you would agree that those are three major ones that I've just referred to in that reform, were envisaged by the Council, I'm sorry, it's not true.
Yeah, because there's a sense that if you criticise the new Mass, and perhaps how it is in practice more than what it is on paper, perhaps, you're accused of denying or attacking the Council. And then on the other side, you've got the trads, let's say, who lump everything on Vatican II unfairly. And so you have this oversimplification, but this binding of the liturgy and the Council, which I think is artificial, because the liturgy was developed after the fact and beyond the intention of the Council Fathers, as you were saying. So
there was much discussion of the liturgy, and there was a sense of reform in the air generally in the society. And I think that was what captured the imagination of the bishops and others and liturgists after the council, feeling that the interest in letting the modern world, as it were, come into the church. This phrase was often used there, aggiornamento, which I think means letting in a new spirit or opening the windows or what have you. The trouble is that there was too much attention paid to that mantra. I lived through all this of the 1960s of the importance of change. Change was a good thing. There was no idea that change might be for the worse. It was always a good thing. The times they are changing was a very popular song that we heard too often in the 1960s, and the church embraced that. And so anything that could be changed would be for the good of the church. Well, it was understandable that they were concerned to evangelise the young. I mean, it was a period of immense social upheaval, the 1960s into the 1970s. So one can sympathise with the need to try new things, to experiment with the liturgy, and as we know, to refashion sanctuaries, to take down the altar rails and move the altar, or create a new table-like altar for the Westward celebration and all the rest of it. It was in that spirit of change, but I think it was just a case, well, naturally, I would say this, and you may agree, that that spirit of change was too extreme, and it was a case in the old phrase of baby being thrown out with bathwater, I think. And the Anglican Church followed Rome very much, and Anglo-Catholics to a large extent, not entirely, but to a large extent and more slowly in that typical Anglican way, followed the Roman changes too in modernising their ancient English liturgy, just as Rome was concocting its new English liturgy for the Anglophone world.
Yeah. Yeah, so just as you were saying, the Anglicans followed the Catholics in simplifying the language of the liturgy, switching to the vernacular, and a very kind of base English, let's say. And the idea was that...
Sorry to interrupt you. The Anglicans had a wonderful vernacular liturgy. I mean, Cranmer, Hilaire Belloc, the great Catholic writer, he had no time for Cranmer the man, but he had a great deal of time for Cranmer the wordsmith. He called him a genius. In liturgical composition. In translation, Cranmer translated from the Latin, right, of course. And so, in a way, the Anglicans were more to be criticised because they had a wonderful vernacular liturgy, and they largely disposed of it. Not entirely, you can still hear it in many places. And as I often say, and people may be interested, the only growing liturgical celebration in the Church of England today, the only one that's growing, is cathedral choral evensong. 700 people will queue up to go to that rite in Westminster Abbey, for example. And that, of course, is entirely in the Book of Common Prayer, the King James Version of the Bible. And interestingly, too, I think, with beautiful music, and the Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis set to traditional settings and what have you, and an anthem from the choir, and the congregations there are growing for that, including many young people. So that says a lot, I think, not only about the desire for a traditional liturgy, but also a desire for a liturgy that is contemplative, where there is time for prayer. And we may talk about this in a minute or two, I don't know, but this obsession with the crudely literal-minded idea of participation, which has dominated so much of the modern liturgical movement in both churches, where you can participate when you are listening quietly and praying reflectively.
Yeah. Yeah, the move in introducing very simplified English, the argument was that it would be better understood by the faithful. However, people seem to know less and less about what's happening in the sanctuary nowadays than they did in the past. And so what went wrong in this regard? Where was it wrong-headed?
Well, first of all, it's a misunderstanding. I've just referred to the misunderstanding of the term participation, active participation. My goodness, we heard that over and we still hear it over and over again. This idea that everything must be clearly expressed so it can be, if possible, immediately understood. Well, we also use the phrase, and this has been preserved in modern liturgies, the mystery of faith. Is God immediately comprehensible? Is the mystery of religion immediately to be expressed in our fallible language? Of course not. So you can actually argue, I think, and I do in some detail in the book, that a language of mystery that isn't willfully mysterious, it isn't there obscure in order to be obscure, but a language of mystery can gesture more to a complete understanding and comprehension of the Godhead and of the real presence in the Mass and all of the rest of it, more so than one that is a banal and failed attempt to be immediately comprehensible. I hope that wasn't too much of a Jabberwocky sentence, but maybe not being very clear myself. But I think this obsession with a language that should be simple is also condescending and patronizing to people. And this touches on another matter that I raise in one of the chapters in the book, this kind of infantile approach to liturgy, that liturgy is a kind of a kindergarten where people have to be instructed at every level. And this can even lead to this awful phenomenon of what they call a paraliturgy, where the priest feels he has to explain what he's about to do and say, well, if the new rite is so immediately comprehensible, why does there need to be any catechesis in the form of the liturgy, in the course of the liturgy, to explain what's happening? Yeah. So there's so much that's wrong in this, and so much of a failure of faith in language to do what the language of liturgy ought to do. And that is to convey the numinous, the transcendental, and also to be fit for worship. Well, the word worship comes from the word meaning something that is worthy. What is worthy to be offered to God? Well, a banal, you used the term correctly, a banal or simple language, an infantile language, just with the music too, this isn't the most worthy thing to be offering. God is worshipped, and we worship God because he is to be worshipped, and we should offer what is most worthy in that process, in language, in music, in ceremony, and in the whole celebration of the rite.
Yeah. You mentioned the priest's desire to explain what's going on, and then it came to mind all the overhead, the projectors basically, which have all the English written there, almost with the little dot going along, so that as if we hadn't already memorized this by rote. And so not only do we have to speak it in English, we have to see it in English, and which I guess takes us to this infantilization and feminization to an extent of the liturgy, which are driving men out of the churches. So if you go to a regular Catholic parish, you'll see that there are very few men in there. I was thinking, what elements in particular are driving them away, and what elements, with, I suppose, inversely, are bringing them to the Latin Mass?
Yes, there's a very good study of this by a Protestant American, but he also refers to Dr. Podles, I think is the gentleman, Podles, who's written from a Catholic point of view on this matter, and the book's called Why Men Hate Going to Church. And this chap has done a whole lot of statistical surveys, and he's shown, and I suppose you can't deny the statistics, that the churches where the women are predominating are the ones that are dying. And you can even have male leadership, as you do have in the Catholic Church, of course, in the clergy. But the congregations can be dominated by women in various ways too. I mean, the moment you start criticising this sort of thing, of course, you're accused of misogyny. But I don't think it's just confined to women. I think that men can have a feminised view of liturgy too. And the main aspect of that, which I focus on, not the only one, but the main one that I focus on, is this appeal to the emotions and to feelings. And this is perhaps it's an unfortunate phrase, but I can't think of a better one. This is a kind of feminized approach to an experience where you're focusing on the emotions and the feelings, and focusing also on yourself. And as C.S. Lewis says about liturgy at its best and worship at its best, I'm never more myself when I'm less myself, when I come out of myself, when I go beyond myself. And I think that for men, it sounds a little too simplistic, I may say, I might think, but I think when men are finding a liturgy that is dominated by an emphasis on their emotions and on feeling good and on all of these gentle qualities, on gentle Jesus, meek and mild, on the lamb rather than the lion of Judah, it drives them away. And it's not something that naturally appeals to the masculine mentality. Whereas in the traditional rites, and in particular in the TLM, what you find is an emphasis on objective truth, on clear and often hard and uncomfortable teaching, and on the sense of something that is outside yourself, beyond yourself, and of course, in the case of the old rite, a form of worship that has been in place for multiple centuries. And I mean, there are many women, I'm sure, who this appeals to as well. So it's not a matter of the male and the female in that narrow sense. It's a matter of the male and female sensibilities. And so, of course, women are strongly present in the traditional communities too, and rightly so. But and I also think it's interesting that, and this is also statistically true, as you probably know, that it's only in these traditional rites where younger people are the predominant element in the congregation. I think I'm the oldest person in my mass-going community, but when I go to, as I occasionally have to do, to a Novus Ordo mass, I can even almost be the youngest. I went to one some years ago now because a dear friend was being received into the church, and I thought I should, of course, support her on that occasion. And I was in a pew, just myself and one other gentleman, and when it came to the Lord's Prayer, the priest said that we now had to hold hands. And this chap, who was at least as old as I was, and I looked at one another, and we just shook our heads. Now, that's just a trivial example, but that kind of thing is very off-putting, I think, for men.
I remember being made uncomfortable. My father and I were invited to come up during the consecration, and I just remember, this is completely wrong. We should not be here. Why are you forcing us to do this? And it went hand in hand with all the other innovations they were doing.
Well, at this mass that I attended, the daughter of my friend was invited, who wasn't a Catholic, was invited up into the sanctuary to elevate the chalice. And that's, people might say, oh, that's lovely. What a lovely gesture. Well, it's apart from the fact that it's completely wrong, it's aliturgical, it's also doctrinally incorrect, and but the emotional appeal of that, the kind gesture of that, trumps this fidelity to the Church's teaching and to the way the liturgy should be celebrated. And emotions and feelings, of course, they have a place in the Christian faith. Goodness me, of course they do, as does fellowship. But the liturgy is a particular form of worship and Christian life, and it needs to be restored to its traditional values.
Now, one of the big changes you argue for, and besides changing the English to a more elevated form, is a return to the ad orientem posture, in which the priest and the faithful faced in the same direction in worship. And you say this is actually the most needful change to make in terms of improving the quality of the liturgy. Why do you think this?
Well, first of all, it is, until our day, the way in which the church is worshipped. And indeed, it's the way in which religious people, including Jewish people, worshipped from historical times, facing the East, facing God, ad orientem. And the main reason why I think the westward facing position is so detrimental to the true liturgical sense is that it forces and produces an inward turning situation. First of all, the communal contemplation of the navel, if you like. But it also focuses our attention very wrongly on the priest, on the celebrant, on the president, as he's sometimes called, of the liturgy, as if he's the chairman of the parish council or something. And you can have absurd situations during, for example, a sung Kyrie eleison, where we're pleading for God's mercy at the beginning of the Mass, with the priest facing the people. Yeah, well, we should all be facing, he included, facing God, facing East. And clergy themselves, including some who celebrate both the old rite and the new rite, facing the people, say it is a completely different experience for them. So it's not only bad and detrimental for the people, but also for the clergy. And this particular priest, Father Ripperger, who's made this comment, if I remember rightly, says that he feels very much that he's facing the congregation and addressing the congregation. Well, in the liturgy, we're addressing and worshipping God. And that's the main reason why I think it's a mistake. And concentrating on the priest, who is the servant of the altar, not the centre of attention of the altar, and his facial expressions and what have you, and whatever mood he might be in, and manual actions, and the fact that he needs to be looking at the congregation when he should be looking at God. I think it's bad for everybody.
Yeah, I tend to like the TLM because it doesn't matter who the priest is. I don't need to worry about who he is because his personality is so minimal. It'll come through in a homily, but otherwise there's nothing. And in that sense, you don't have to worry about if you gel with his personality or not, because he's there to serve the Mass.
Yes.
And also, I guess, could you speak more to this idea of the need to perform? Like, when you turn the priest around, all of a sudden he is the center of attention, and so that can manifest in these different ways, right?
Well, that comes into the context too of a younger person that I was talking to who grew up. He was a teenager in the 1980s and left the church. Then he's now come back to it and come to the traditional rite, which he didn't know at all, of course, from his younger days. And he said that the general sense that he had in the 1980s and 90s, before he stopped going to Mass, was that the church was trying to entertain him. And the priest there is seen as a kind of an MC or a compere. And I mean, some of the grotesque examples, I know this isn't normative, but some grotesque examples where the priest, dresses as a clown or starts singing or playing a guitar and what have you. This too is counterproductive to nurturing a true liturgical sense and a true worship, I think, and just focusing very much again on emotions and on the need to entertain and what have you, to feel good as a result of that.
Now, people often give beauty as one of the reasons that they prefer the Latin Mass over the new Mass, and sometimes they're accused of being superficial. How would you respond to those criticisms?
Yes, a very common criticism of the position of those who prefer the old rite, and this would be true in the Anglican Church too, and as well, where some of the old-fashioned Anglo-Catholic parishes still do worship in the old form, ad orientem, using the Cranmerian version of the form of the Roman Mass. The main problem there with this accusation that, you're just interested in the aesthetics. This is an aesthetic turn on for you. You're just obsessed, as you said, with beauty, for example, they allege. Well, since when did offering something beautiful to God become disreputable? If you look through the Christian centuries, it's through the appreciation of beauty that many have come to know God. There's a wonderful word in Alice in Wonderland, that lovely children's tale where Alice talks about uglification. Well, I think so much of the modern liturgical movement in architecture, in vesture, in language and certainly in music has been a case of uglification. So those who charge us with being defenders and celebrants of beauty, are they suggesting that beauty is not important in offering something worthy in the worship of the Eternal Father, that we should offer ugly things instead? They probably say, well, the beauty is too complicated or what have you. We need more simplistic things, but then you go too much in the other direction too. So I think that's a bankrupt argument to say that appreciating liturgical beauty, look at the beauty of the Gregorian chant. So much appreciated, often by non-Catholics too, on CDs or in the concert hall or what have you, and which was supposed to have pride of place in liturgical celebrations according to the conciliar documents. How many Catholics today would even know what Gregorian chant was? And it is the most beautiful and the most ancient form of Western music.
Yeah, you hinted at, you said, well, in terms of people will now defend banal liturgy, and they'll say that, well, any valid mass is a good mass because Jesus is Eucharistically present. Do you think that that's a good argument?
Oh, yes, you have heard that. Michael Davies, who wrote much on liturgy in the 1970s and 80s, said rather caustically, Catholics will put up with anything as long as they're convinced that the Mass is valid. Well, this is at a very low level of expectation, isn't it? But a very essential one, an important one. It does remind me, if this story isn't an inappropriate analogy, of a mother I was talking to some years ago, and I was asking her how her daughters were going, and she said to me, well, Barry, they're not pregnant, they're not on drugs, they don't have any tattoos, and they don't have any piercings. And I thought, well, that's reassuring, but I hope there's more to be said for these young girls, as they indeed turned out to be as they grew up. Well, to say that you could celebrate the Mass, as happened, of course, in wartime, for example, on the battlefield, just in a corrugated iron hut or outdoors, of course it's valid. But to argue that that's how we should, that's the limit of what we should be offering is surely to shortchange faith and the expression of faith liturgically. We should bring the best of ourselves in every sense to the celebration of the Mass.
Yeah. Now, with you being an Anglican turned Catholic, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the Ordinariate Rite, which represents a fusion of Anglican patrimony and the Roman Missal. What do you find are the strengths and weaknesses of this?
Well, it's a noble venture, and many thanks, of course, to Pope Benedict, who initiated it, if I remember correctly. So many details about liturgy that are swimming around in my head after writing a book like that, so I've got to be careful to get everything right in remembering them all. There's a problem with it, though. There are virtues, which I'll come to in a minute, but there's an essential problem with it, which you could deduce from things I've said earlier. And that is, and you correctly used the term, the Anglican patrimony. Well, of course, those who know the Anglican patrimony as it is celebrated in the Ordinariate have to be more or less my age. They had to have grown up when we had the Book of Common Prayer in its various forms, High Church and Low Church, but it was the same like the Latin Mass was the same wherever you went. So Cranmer's language was there wherever you went, whether it was a High Church place with incense and the rest of it, or a Low Church place with a simple celebration. The Mass, the language of the Eucharist was the same, and the other parts of the office as well. I don't know what the future of the Ordinariate itself can be if people, because so many of those who have joined it, I imagine, I know, in fact, are people who, of course, were Anglicans and had grown up with that and wanted to be Catholics and have still the beauty of the music and the old hymns and grammar language and so on. But will that constituency still be around in 40, 50 years' time? But what is very valuable about the Ordinariate, and I argued this in the book, is that it shows how a beautiful vernacular language, Cranmer was a genius, as I said, as Hilaire Belloc says, and as I say in his translation. We haven't had any people to match him, alas, since. We've had committees. I mean, can a committee write a liturgy? It's hard to imagine. That it sets a model for the wider Catholic Church to pay attention to, in the Anglophone world, of course we're talking about, English-speaking world, to see just how a beautiful language of liturgy in English can be perfectly adapted to the Catholic rite. And I just hope, and I say this at some point, that there's something to be learned from by Novus Ordo people from that, and I hope that that's what I would hope would be the future of it, that it would provide a model for how a beautiful language of liturgy in English can be used more broadly in the Catholic Church, so it's valuable in that way.
Hmm. Did you get a sense that anything was lost in the effort to conform, I guess, the Anglican patrimony into the Roman Rite? Is there a sense of that something's been left behind, or no?
No, I don't think so. You see, there was a book called The English Missal, which came out, again, I'm just relying on my memory now, but it came out, I think, in the 1920s or so, and that was for Anglicans, for Anglo-Catholics. That was the Roman Rite using Cranmerian language, and where things weren't in Cranmer, whatever it might have been, it was added in the style of Cranmer, usually pretty well, so there's nothing that is missing, in my view, because it's been perfectly adapted to the Roman liturgy, and just using that beautiful language.
So you argue in the book of the need to recover the best of liturgical English, both for the Anglican Church and for the English-speaking Catholic churches. And for you, that means Cranmerian English, that we find in the Book of Common Prayer. Are you proposing that we replace the English Novus Ordo with the Ordinariate Rite in the West, or are you proposing something different?
No, in my dreams, I'm proposing that, but I realise that that's not likely to happen. Or, realistically, I'm hoping that my book will encourage the people who have the responsibility for further translations. Cardinal Pell's Vox Clara Committee was mindful, as you may know, mindful of the need to elevate the language of the Roman Rite in English. But the problem there, well-meaning, well-intentioned as it was that they felt that this could be achieved by inserting occasionally more elaborate words into the present form, into the previous form of the English, of the Roman Rite. But there's a lack, here's an aesthetic judgment, but it's an important one. There's a lack of a consistency in that. I mean, the problem, and we just can't avoid this fact, is you need people of genius and you need wordsmiths. That committee, that Vox Clara committee, consisted entirely of theologians and liturgical historians and what have you. There wasn't a poet there. And the language of liturgy is a kind of poetry of address to God and of conveying of the numinous and the transcendental and everything. And the Latin Rite does that by the sheer fact of the mysteriousness of the Latin language. But you can also convey something of that, and this is what Cranmer did. His English is of a very Latinate kind, both in vocabulary and in rhythm and cadence. I mean, he had just had the ear, he had this brilliant genius, the ear for this sort of thing. So Cardinal Pell's Vox Clara committee, and even the phrase of the committee, which means speaking clearly. Well, again, we have this emphasis on how important it is to be clear, but I feel failed, actually, even though it's an improvement, in that just a few polysyllabic words were added as a kind of a pearl of utterance in the midst of some rather banal and prosaic writing, which, if you're being hypercritical, you could say actually draws attention to the poverty of the rest of the Rite when you've got these few fancy words there, often Latinate words. So, but that showed an awareness of the need to do something. And my hope is, you've got to be optimistic, my hope is that as newer versions come through and newer committees look at this, that they'll understand the need to continue elevating the language in that way. But there are a lot of critics of that too. There was a lot of criticism of that Rite when it came out, saying we don't want this fancy language, we need to have something simple that people can understand immediately. Well, I mean, this is again patronising and condescending to people. You grow in understanding. And something that you were more or less alluding to a minute or two ago, I think, which made me think of this, is how important it is to have a language of liturgy that is memorable. And that's right, you were talking about things being put up on the screen, which you already knew. Well, one of the marvellous things about a memorable liturgical language in Latin or in Cranmerian English, and there's the proof of it in both cases, is that this stays with you through life. And it stays with you beyond the occasion of the liturgical celebration, because the words, you take them, it's a beautiful phrase, you take them to heart. They're learned by heart. And the repetition is the life of liturgy. And you repeat them Sunday by Sunday, Mass by Mass, and they become part of your prayer life, part of your spirituality generally, not just for that hour and a half or whatever it is on Sunday or whatever. So that means it's got to be language that is worthy of being remembered and of being cherished. And I think that so much of the modern liturgical writing, though it's dogmatically correct, doctrinally correct, very important, it has to be those things, but it's lacking. That's the beginning of it. It's lacking what it most essentially should have, and that is a beauty of utterance and a memorability of utterance and a consistency of utterance. And if you feel you've got to be constantly updating your liturgy to speak to the modern mind, however that's going to be interpreted and the years go by, does this mean you've got to be in a constant state of updating? I mean, what was modern in 1970 is not going to sound modern in 2070. And
not even now.
Yeah, exactly. And you can't live in a constant state of revolution, as it were, in life. The liturgy and the church's teaching should be presenting a constancy in our madly ever-changing world of people. And this is why I think so many young people are yearning for it and are being drawn to it, which I think is a very encouraging sight. I've spoken to younger people about this, and they say that this is what appeals to them, that there's hard teaching, which they find challenging, and there's a beauty of worship and a dignity and a decorum of worship and everything which they find is so different from the outside world. There was a young woman who went to the last World Youth Day Mass. I think it was in Canada, wasn't it? I can't think where the last World Youth Day was, wherever it was. Yeah, she was complaining. She said, we had these priests gyrating with guitars and everything. And she said, if we want to go to a nightclub and dance, well, we'll go there. But when we come to Mass, we're looking for something different. And I think that the churches are, I'm hoping they're waking up to this.
Well, keeping with the issue of liturgical prayer, another aspect is the lectionary. So although you talk about hard teachings, even though we increased the amount of readings you hear in the English Mass, they actually stripped out a lot of the difficult, challenging stuff. So you never actually hear it, such as unworthy reception of communion from 1 Corinthians 11. But in addition to that, we tend to use the New Jerusalem Bible translation or the Jerusalem Bible translation, which is objectively awful. It's not accurate and it's not poetic. So would you be arguing that as well as conforming the prayers to a more Cranmerian style, that we would also go back to the King James Bible to read from it?
Yes. You're meaning here in the Novus Ordo, right?
In the Novus Ordo, yes.
Right. Yes, well, I mean, very important, and again, it's an aesthetic quality, but I don't know why we should be ashamed about talking about aesthetics, which is another word for talking about the beautiful. You should try to have consistency, and part of the consistency would be in music, but also, most importantly, of course, in language. And ideally, you would have the language of the scriptural readings that matched those of the liturgy that you were celebrating in English. And the King James Bible, of course, famously has that, comes from that same culture, which is the high point of the golden age of the English language, the age of Shakespeare and Milton, as well as of Cranmer and the translators of the King James Version, as it's called, or the authorised version, to be used in churches. And it's important to remember, very important to remember, seeing you're raising that version, that people forget this, perhaps we never knew it. Most of the people at that time, they all had to go to church, of course, everyone went to church, and most of them were illiterate. So this was written explicitly, so it would appear to the auditory imagination, to the ear, and be memorable, which of course it is. I mean, if you look at any dictionary of quotations in the English language for literary works over the many centuries, the largest entry is the King James Version of the Bible, which novelists and poets and others have taken into their works for quotation. So whether it would be precisely that translation or something in its style, like the Revised Standard Version or what have you, which corrects some of the mistakes that they made, they didn't have all the biblical scholarship today. I would certainly argue that it should aim to be something that is, otherwise you'd have a terrible inconsistency, wouldn't you? You're always going to have an inconsistency in the sermon, of course, in the homily. You can't expect the clergy to be speaking a Cranberrian English, but that's a different situation. Yes, I think so.
Okay. And while I'm thinking of scripture, what do you make of the Douay Rheims translation? So a lot of people insist on that because it's the translation from the Vulgate, but I can't understand it. Like I'll read it, and I think it's super literal. Have you had much experience with it?
No, I'm not a biblical scholar, so I will refrain from commenting on that.
Fair enough. So finally, Barry, you have an abiding interest in animal welfare. So we are making a bit of a change of subject.
Yeah.
So what do you appreciate most about animals? And was there an event which motivated you to get involved in their protection?
Yeah, well, talking about my dear parents, they were both animal lovers, and we had a bit of a reputation in the suburb. And so it was quite common for us to wake up on a morning and find a kitten in a cardboard box on the front doorstep, and of course my mother would take them in. So I grew up with animals, and seeing you mentioning, and I was thinking this the other day when this came up in the discussion on these issues, I do remember the first time I became an animal activist, if you like, which was as a teenager, when a rodeo was being put on in a parish. And I was no more than 12 or 13, but there's a lot of cruelty involved in rodeo, as a matter of fact. And I wrote to the bishop, aged all of 12 or 13, and complained about this in handwritten letters, donkey's years before email or anything, of course. And I very promptly got a handwritten letter back saying that he was very disturbed to hear this, and he assured me it wouldn't happen again. So I feel that there's a great deal of cruelty to animals still. Pope Francis has said we must be kind to animals, and we certainly should. And I often quote in this context the statement of Dean William Ing, who was an outspoken Dean of St Paul's Cathedral in London. Deans of St Paul's Cathedral tend to be outspoken people. John Donne was one several centuries before that, of course. And Dean Ing really expresses what I feel on this subject when he says, and I can quote it exactly, I think, "We have treated our distant cousins of fur and feather so badly that were they to create a religion, there is no doubt that they would represent the devil in human form." And I think it is a great shame, to the degree really of being a scandal. I would have been hearing sermons now for some nearly 70 years. So I've heard hundreds, if not thousands, of sermons. And I don't think I've ever heard one talking about this aspect of God's creation that should be treated with kindness. But I was grateful for the Pope saying that.
Yeah, it's a good point. It is one of those things that you never do hear, but the church does speak almost obsessively nowadays about climate change and the season of creation. So I guess as an animal lover who cares deeply about creation, what do you make of the I don't know how the church presents its environmental teaching, particularly liturgically, I suppose.
Well, it's not something I suppose I should think about that. I haven't thought about it much. I mean, it's, as you say, they do speak of these things, don't they, of respecting the environment. So I think that's a good move, yes. But I don't know how that's to be, apart from prayers about it, I don't know how that would be further represented in the liturgy. I like the ceremony that Anglicans and Catholics have regularly of the blessing of animals. For example, that's always an amusing sort of event. I think children enjoy that a lot. But no, I'll have to think more about that issue of the environment, I think. Yes.
Yeah, I just like to see. I suppose it's dealt with in the abstract, whereas I think as like specific prayers, when you do have the blessing of animals, it's for animals, and it's not creation out there, and it's not Mother Earth out there. It's it's God's creation, and these things deserve our attention. Finally, Barry, please give a plug for your book. So where can people find it and all the rest?
Oh, thank you so much, Mark. It's very kind of you. Well, it's available if people are in Australia from Quadrant Bookstore online. You simply type in Quadrant Bookstore, and you'll find there not only is it available online, but there's signed copies by me and at a very reasonable price. Otherwise, if you just, I've got an unusual name, so you type in my name, SPURR, and put language, liturgy, and it'll pop up with all the usual places, Amazon and Booktopia and the rest of it, and it's readily available.
Okay, and just a plug for our channel, if you've liked our interview with Barry, please like, share and subscribe to our channel. Get us to 1,000. That's our milestone that we're looking for. Also, our executive director, Anna Crone, has this wonderful newsletter she puts out weekly on a Wednesday, so you can sign up for that at tmc.org.au. Professor Barry Spurr joining us from Sydney. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Mark. Thank you very much.